I'm just curious, at the end of Four Lines, if you had lots of questions about what was going on the other side with the forces of law and order and people investigating potential terrorist activity, if the seeds of this began there and you just something playing in the back of your head.
There is a link, but I can tell the story, any order I tell it in will be the wrong order. But I will get to the answer to your question in about 1 minute and 12 seconds time. But it starts, so the person, there is a Four Lines link. I haven't started yet, by the way, so not now. But I mean, this film sort of, I processed the information that became this film before I knew what I was doing. I'm not wishing to be obscure here, but I just saw a TV report about the FBI having arrested an army planning a full-scale ground war against the United States. It was on British TV news, and it was pretty striking. There was a big arrest. The Attorney General of the United States was making the announcement, and it was a bigger plot than 9/11 that had been foiled. And I sort of stored that in my head. And 2 or 3 years later, I met someone whose book I had read during the research for Four Lines, and I met him in Washington, D.C. He's ex-CIA sort of terrorism analyst, and he was involved in the trial of that case, with the full-scale ground war case. And he said it wasn't a full-scale ground war. Do you know what it was? It was 7 builders whose plan to take over America involved riding into Chicago on horses and taking over the city because they said a man respects another man on a horse. This was described as the biggest plot since 9/11, and I said, well, what are you talking about? What's going on? And he'd been asked to be a witness in the trial for the defence, basically saying that, you know, these guys were not anything like terrorists. But what had happened is that they'd fallen in with an FBI informant who was offering them $50,000 to come up with a plan against the government. And their first plan was to lead a protest to the governor's house to protest against conditions in the projects. And the informant said, you're not going to get anything for that. You're going to have to riff higher. You're going to have to think of something much more damaging. So they sat around, smoked a lot of weed, and came up with this idea that they could knock over the Sears Tower and swamp Chicago in a tidal wave. This is all the evidence that was recorded by the informant. And this is the kind of talk that got them sent down. I mean, they were convicted as Al-Qaeda terrorists. 6 of them were Haitian Catholics. So there was a level of distortion that was pretty striking. You think that enough of the wandering go-go, yeah.
My eyes get really weird.
Well done, Chef Book Group. So I think that's sort of where it started. And when I found out that this wasn't one-off, this was in fact a weird kind of MO that the FBI had sort of developed for about 10 different reasons since 9/11. It's sort of, that's the point where it clicked into I thought, oh, I can't get out of this now, I'm going to have to do a film about it, because it was just so extraordinary. And when it says 100 true stories at the start, that's essentially an order, it's a lie. It's more like 350, but I felt 350 would seem weirdly pedantic. So I just got the number of zeros right. So yeah, there is a link. So I should have just said yes, shouldn't I?
I'm just curious about the period when you made Four Lines, because I think just before that time, 2 films came out. It was a short film made in the States called Out of Status, and then the New Zealand filmmaker Alison McLean made a film called Persons of Interest, and both of them were about American citizens, not naturally born American citizens, who were Muslim, who just disappeared, taxi drivers, workers in factories, off the streets of their hometowns, and the families didn't know where they'd gone for months on end, and then they find out they've been picked up by the FBI. And I just wonder, in the timeline of things, if that was the first stage of what was happening. And in your research of these stories, is this something that followed on? When they couldn't find any suspects out of all these people that they held captive for months on end, and then moved on?
Well, it's not. There were cases. I mean, there was another case where a Muslim lawyer was arrested and told that he was connected with the Barcelona bombing, and he wasn't. So there were lots of cases where, I guess, and he got off eventually after a sort of protracted series of weird escapades in court. But I think they were already doing this at the same time. They marched in step. Basically, the FBI after 9/11 had a lot of covering up to do, because a whistleblower within the organisation revealed that they'd had a laptop that related to the Twin Towers attack, and that they could have discovered a lot of the details of the plot before it happened. But for various pedantic and sort of asking the higher-ups who didn't know what was going on for permission to crack into the laptop, they failed. So they started saying, even if we had cracked that laptop, we wouldn't have been able to stop the plot, because believe us, these people have penetrated really deep. They're very clever, very sophisticated, and it wouldn't have been possible to stop that attack. So they sort of gave rise to this idea that there was a sleeper cell in every city. And then having said that, they then had to behave as if, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but they then had to, having said there's a sleeper cell in every city, they then had to go and find the sleeper cell in every city. And of course there was a great deal of money suddenly available to protect the homeland. And it's pretty difficult. It's because you only get one chance. With it. If you're investigating a sort of drug chain, drug selling chain, or any normal sorts of crimes they investigate, there's a chain that you can investigate in real time. It's much harder with a terrorist attack. And so they sort of found that it was easier to pick on somebody who stuck out like a sore thumb, send in informants to wind them up, invent a terrorist plot and cast someone to take part in it, and then arrest them when they do. And you can say to the court, well, we got this person or these people to do this. Isn't it better that we got to them before the real guys, and shouldn't they be in jail? And they found so far that the jury always say, yes, they should be in jail. So there's no real defence against this. You would have thought it might be entrapment, but no, it's never fit. So it's a 99% conviction rate, and if you ask the Department of Justice, what do you mean a 99% conviction rate? They will say, I know it should be 100. So it's pretty, and you know, it's kind of, it's very interesting, because it's very easy to think, oh well, yeah, the FBI set people up, but when you see the step-by-step process that's involved, it's really quite staggering. I found anyway.
One of the stories that I read in one interview with you, you talked about a schizophrenic planning to fly a model plane with Semtex on it into Washington, but had been supplied most of the materials by the FBI, which takes us to the first scene we see in this film. How far can they go in supplying materials before they cross that line?
Well, they don't supply real materials.
No,
so they
no.
supply. So this guy lived in Boston, and he was diagnosed schizophrenic, and they just encouraged him to come up with a plan to fly model planes into the dome of the Capitol building. And the way these cases is plotted is that essentially the attorney supervises it with the case agents, the FBI case agents, so that the narrative is plotted almost like a script. So that guy, once he goes off and buys switches, once he goes off and buys the model planes, these are all incriminating steps in a program that he's being led along by people he thinks are his friends. And he was arrested because he took the train to Washington, was arrested as soon as he got out with a backpack full of what he was plasticine or something he thought was Semtex, and some model planes. Meanwhile, I mean, the FBI had spent 18 months winding this guy up. Meanwhile, they had ignored the two guys who were plotting the marathon bombing. Because it's sort of like, if you put yourself in the position of an FBI agent, you're getting more encouragement from something like this. You've targeted this guy, he might be dangerous. Well, number one, if you said, is this person dangerous? The next question that's going to occur to you is, what if I decide they're not dangerous and they turn out to be? Better keep on, better find out if they're really dangerous. So you're kind of already being drawn into your own game, if you like, and you keep getting little rewards. He's got to buy switches. He's putting the wires inside the model plane. It's all, it looks like a success. Whereas the Tsarnaev brothers were a kind of blip on a radar. The Russians mentioned them. The FBI went, I probably don't really, they're not really. Because, you know, they were much less well lit, if you like. So they've sort of set up things deliberately, so almost as if they've set up ghosts to chase. Because a lot of the people in these sting cases are just basically stick out. They're not terrorists, but they've been turned into convicted terrorists, so in a way they are. So it works, as long as you don't ask too many questions. And you know, we spoke to a lot of defense lawyers. In fact, the guys who defended the guy from Boston who was trying to fly the model planes into the dome of the Capitol building, they were in the Fourth Circuit. They were the ones who told us that the Fourth Circuit is known as the place you go for a rocket docket. They were the ones who said that sometimes, because the Fourth Circuit is the easiest place to get a conviction, I mean, nowhere's very difficult, but the Fourth Circuit is easy. That's where the idea of arresting someone somewhere else and then flying them to the Fourth Circuit and rearresting them when they land so that the case can be tried there. That's where that comes from in the film. And I mean, these defense lawyers told us that the first terrorist case they tried, they went into court and on day one the jury were dressed as the American flag. That's how much they knew they weren't going to win the case. And they said that all their job is basically they never defend the suspect in court, they simply negotiate with the judge to the length of the sentence, because if you plead guilty you'll get 5 years off, or a bit more if your lawyer's really tenacious.
I'll open in a moment. Just two questions about your research. How open were people, and how far did you go with the research? See, I've got this idea in my head that someone at the FBI said, we got this guy calling up, he wants to speak to us, let's find out about him. Oh look, he's a news anchor on a TV news program in the UK, that's fine, we'll talk to him.
It's not even that. I mean, the day I turned up at the FBI office in LA, I mean, this was a meeting we'd set up 3 months previously. The person who met me said, I've just Googled you. This is an organisation that's supposed to be looking out for itself and everyone else. It's the same when they have a sort of airport security system as you enter the building. So you have to leave your phone in a little bag. They don't check if you've got another phone. It's sort of, but she actually took me to a sort of an unused floor and said, I've just Googled you, and it looks like you might be going to be critical about us in some way, or maybe kind of satirize what we're doing. And I thought, here it comes. And I thought she was going to say, do not do that. Instead she said, please don't, because everyone works here really hard and they're really dedicated to their job, and they'd just be really upset. And I thought, shit. I could feel myself wanting to confirm that of course I wouldn't do anything like that, but I thought, don't say no. Do not be lured into saying something that you're obviously denying something you're obviously going to do. So in the interest of some pointless honesty, I just answered obliquely. I'm interested in workplace dynamics and how people do it. And I could see her going, he's not saying no. But the truth is that actually, once you've been in a place for an hour, the conversation changes anyway. I mean, you get the grown-up tour, but at the other end, the Nerf gun thing in the film came from a guy who works in he's an agent in a counter-terrorism office, and he said to me, 50% of my day is calculating Nerf gun trajectories. Because there's 4 files of agents in my office, and we're all involved in a Nerf gun war. The most bitter dispute is between those agents investigating Sunni terrorism. You know, I won't even finish the sentence, but it's true. I thought we can't even use that, that's too route one. But he said, we've got a low ceiling, so if you're going to bombard somebody at the most convenient point, i.e. on their most important phone call of the day, you don't want your Nerf gun pellet to hit the ceiling. You've got to get the trajectory just right so it hits them in the face while they're talking. And I was going, and it kind of like, I spoke to him, they do lots of other things as well, but you sort of go, oh, this is the texture of the workplace. It's, it seemed, if you meet an FBI agent for the first time, they are suit and tie, they think they're the best agency in America, and it doesn't take long for that to sort of unravel. So they're happy to talk in a way. They just
So you kind of happy when happy might not be the right word, but when the Horowitz report came out.
That's interesting, because that shows something quite like this. There's a criticism of the kind of loose way that informants are worked, and I mean there've been a couple that have come out recently, but they come out in relation to white people. So that was in relation to the Trump investigation. Actually, was it the Trump or was it the investigation into the Hillary Clinton. It was a 2016 investigation anyway, so it was Hillary Clinton one. But it's sort of, so what's interesting about that report is that it reveals something that they do in these cases, but it's come out, I think, because it involves white people. You know, it really is. Black and brown people are always held to be second-rate by the FBI. They always have been. They briefly tried to swell their ranks, and they got up to about 6% non-whites. That's gone back down to 4%. They still, or at least 2 months ago, they still held eco-terrorists, whatever the hell they are, to be more of a threat to America than extreme right-wing groups. Christopher Wray actually said that. So, you know, there's a kind of inbuilt, shall we call it kindly, xenophobia within the FBI. And I don't know why I started talking about that. What was your question? To do with the criticism of so they do get criticised, but not normally in this case. They know that they're pretty safe. There's been very, very little pushback because the kind of communities that they're, let's use the word, preying on, don't have the resources to kick back very hard.
And I'm sure they would offer a defence if they were confronted with it, but was there ever conversation that you heard or documentation that you were supplied with that discussed directly racial profiling and the proportion of people of colour that were actually pursued by the FBI?
Well, you see, they very early on, after 2001, they set up a system called domain management, which was essentially an increased level of surveillance under the increased surveillance powers that were permitted through the Patriot Act, to spy on communities that they felt would be the first to offer up the next 9/11. Lo and behold, they were black and brown communities. So there wasn't really any debate about that. It was like a sort of, that wasn't even questioned. And actually the people that they used initially to build their counterterrorism program it was as if they used the first people who came through the door who said they knew anything about Islam. So they had a pretty ignorant set of briefings on which to go out and try and catch people who, number one, are difficult to find, and number two, aren't really very often there. So you can see that they had their work cut out. And talking about whether they should be profiling Muslims or indeed the kind of the black American version of Islam, which is, or the Nation of Islam, or those all sorts of little groups. You know, there's a group called the Moorish Science Temple who aren't Islamic but have a book called a Quran, and they're not any sort of Islam that would be recognised, if you like, by the orthodoxy in Mecca, but they were a sort of splinter group of the Garveyite kind of black emancipation movement in the early 20th century. They had some link to one of the guys in the Liberty City case, but that would have gone off as a kind of a warning light when it's really nothing to do with it, because they have a book called the Quran, which actually which is about Jesus and reads like a sort of apocryphal section of the Bible, but it's called the Quran, so that's all you need to know. So the Moorish Science Temple are, you know, in the crosshairs of suspicion.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We've got some roving mics. Someone has their hand up there and someone down the front. If we can bring the mic down to the front here. Oh, yeah.
He's grabbed it. It was on the way to him, and he's stolen the mic. Okay.
That's quite an irritating question.
To you, it's irritating. Wait till it gets to me.
I don't think the mic is on.
Yeah, it's not on.
Can you just shout?
Okay, I will. I'll shout. The film kind of highlights the way you utilise comedy to sort of reveal social and political issues. And I think we're sort of missing you by not the message. And would you ever return to British television?
Would you ever return?
Especially with the way you pick and tease the media.
Would you ever return to British television?
Do you think television is the medium that, if you like, needs returning to at the moment? I'm not throwing the question back at you gratuitously, but I mean, it just occurred to me to ask you that.
Yeah, well, yes, I do actually.
Okay. I'll go with that. I mean, it's not like I sort of got stuck in Miami. I mean, it may seem like it's like just babbling on and on about America. I didn't really know I was going there. it just seemed to be relevant actually to a whole load of things that we've forgotten are even operational. You know, we've forgotten the name of the war on terror. It's still going on. It's still having huge implications. It allows us to, you know, permit British citizens to have their citizenship cut off for one reason or another, either to get drowned or to be left in a refugee camp somewhere for their children to die, or whatever it is. You know, every day we're still feeling the effects of it. We just have forgotten to note it. We're about to have all our phones, the contents, everything in our phones, available to the government through the Investigatory Powers Act. So there's all sorts of things which are going on, and let alone the idea of sort of dividing us. I mean, when George Bush said, you're either for us or against us, he created the divide, I think, which Donald Trump, well, at least arguably, went on to exploit. He kind of gave a new sharp blade to the dividing mechanism in American society. Not the only divide that there is, but you see what I mean? There's kind of division taught for quite a long time, so it seemed important to do, and it does have something to say to us indirectly anyway. And I think in terms of looking at British television right now, I think, you know, television is, at least in terms of fact spew, is sort of less cocky than it was when, to me, it seemed to be asking for it 20 years ago. It doesn't have the status. In fact, it's slightly, more than slightly worried about what its position is, because facts are flying out, or pseudo-facts or crypto-facts. Information is flying out from all sorts of other sources, and TV is wondering what its, or TV news, let's say, is wondering what its job is. So, yes, I would certainly pay attention to this place, but I'm not sure it would be TV news. The other thing is that once you've investigated something once, you're less likely to be interested in doing it again. But, you know, there's lots of things to have a go at, don't you think?
Down at the front here, and then we'll go further back.
Ah, that was the original. Yeah.
Hi, this is a very selfish question, so I apologise.
Selfish question?
Yes.
Looking forward to that.
So I apologise to everyone else in the room. I'm currently doing my dissertation on you. Please don't clap. And specifically your use of animals in your comedy, and I wanted to ask you, and I was delighted to see the horse in this film, and I wanted to ask why. Why do you like animals so much?
Let's be frank. Well, the funny thing about if there is anything funny about the horse, the horse really crept in. I mean, the horse made some strong advances after the film had gone into pre-production. I auditioned Marchand, who did a fantastic audition for Moses, and then I sort of met up with him a couple of weeks later, and we had a long chat about where he came from. He comes from northwest Philadelphia, where there was an attack by the FBI on a group called The Move in the 80s that was run by a black separatist called John Africa, and they tried to form a separate kingdom in Philadelphia. And there's a great documentary about it called Let the Block Burn, because that's what the mayor said when the FBI dropped a barrel bomb on this property and the whole place caught fire. They let the whole block burn. So it's a notorious incident that in some way kind of prefigures this sort of thing. And in that conversation, it occurred to me, I just thought, oh, if I want the FBI to give Moses something really outre to show how prepared they are to indulge someone in order to catch them, or to kind of lull them into a false sense of security or friendship. And I just thought horses, because horses came up, wasn't a big thing, was it? Because in the Liberty City case I mentioned earlier, there were horses, just they didn't have any. I thought, what if they went as far as giving the guy a horse? So I said to Marchand, can you ride a horse? He said, yes. And I thought, this is good. And I said, well, what do you think if Moses rode through town on a horse? And he went, there's a guy in Philly who rides through rush hour traffic and dreadlocks on a horse, bareback, kind of most days. And I thought, okay, the horse is with us. I didn't know it was going to talk at that time. It was just going to be a quadruped with a roll. And I thought, while we were making the film, a friend of mine read the script, and she said, I kind of wanted the horse to rescue Moses at the end. Now this was before the horse turned up at the cafe at the end, and I thought, ridiculous idea. Why did I give you the script to read? And I sort of woke up the next morning. I thought, actually, the reason she said that was not literal as I'd taken it, but was a feeling. And I thought that feeling is incumbent in Moses' relationship with the horse. He was talking to the horse, it didn't talk back. So we filmed the horse turning up at the cafe. And then in the edit, I thought, let's put one word in its mouth. And Billy, the editor, went, you fucking idiot, what are you talking about? It's one of those things where, so the horse emerged slowly and therefore was nothing to do with the fact that I did a zoology degree. I don't even really like horses. I mean, I don't mind them. We had a producer who said, I hate horses, they're just good for glue. And I thought, you're weird, why are we working with you? But otherwise animals, I mean, you know, I'm not going to do the dissertation for you, but they do pop up, I think, because I have a limited imagination. It's quite, I mean, animals are they're not inherently funny, but some animals are funnier than others, and it depends what they're doing. But, you know, an animal with posture is immediately somewhere sort of anthropomorphizing itself, in my view, not consciously, but it makes itself available. It's a bad sentence. It's my favourite, and it varies. Depends, you know, it depends. You know, I like a secretary bird.
We've got someone with a hand up there. As a footnote to your dissertation, you might want to look at three-legged dogs in Ken Loach's films.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I was just wondering, sort of, what is exactly the American intelligence services? What do they have to lose by not reporting these kind of issues? We saw the media coming in, they clicked on the telly and they thought, oh shit, this is being reported in public news. But isn't that exactly what those intelligence agencies want? They want the public to feel that fear. They want the public to feel that they are sort of having a duty in protecting them. And I would like to know, during your investigation, what exactly you wheeled out in terms of the relationship between those intelligence services and the media. Do they just rely on the media to reflect the problems that they create in society, or do they have a direct relationship with the media?
Well, if you watch a documentary, a very good documentary about another one of these cases, it's called The Newburgh Sting, and it's about 4 guys who were wound up in upstate New York by an informant who was offering them $250,000 to come up with something. That's what he had to offer them before they said they'd get off their arse and do anything. And even then they said, well, we'll put the bomb in the trunk of a car, but can we let it off at night so that no one gets hurt? I think it's in that documentary that by the time they're arrested, somebody mentions what they call the perp walk, which is a deliberately humiliating moment. You remember the picture of Richard Reed after he'd been arrested, kind of like that, through a taxi or a limo window, looking a right mess. They always want that, so they'll prime the press for the right opportunity to do that. Just as a little example of the relationship. I think on a bigger sense, there's, on a bigger scale or a bigger canvas, there is a PR element to these cases because they want to send the message that, you know, you're being watched, don't even think about it. And I mean, that's quite common. Happens here, you know, with conspicuously heavy raids, you know, 10, 15 years ago in Operation Trident, they went in heavy so the message would spread. That's a standard law enforcement thing. But at that building, that's the FBI office, that is the new build FBI office. They used to be rather more discreet, and so people go, that's the FBI office, but it would look rather nondescript. That looks like something out of Batman. It's meant to be recognised and talked about. And even when we went to shoot the pictures of that, we flew a plane over that office thinking that we'll get one shot at this and then we'll be hedged off, but they just lay there like a big tart. You know, I mean, we went to the gate and they sort of go, no pictures, you can't take pictures here, you can't take pictures here. And you go, really? And they go, if you walk across the road, you can take as many as you like. So they want to be, so there is a PR.
Is that what you meant by sort of, it looks like a psychological disorder?
Which one?
The building itself.
Yeah. I think it's a ridiculous building. I mean, it's a message, and it does look a bit. If it were a person, it looks fucked up. But I think they just think it looks noticeable, prominent, steely, glassy, weird. I mean, it's very hard to photograph that building in a still picture without it looking fake, because it's got sort of deliberately offset geometry, which makes it look like one of those super clean, and it's very clean, so it looks like a sort of super clean architect's version of what this building will look like. I don't think that has a terrifying aspect, but it does make it sticks in your head when you've seen it. So there's all sorts of public messaging going on. And of course, every time they make one of these arrests, they have saved the nation or the city. So it's an ongoing narrative. In fact, most Americans think that most arrests are a damn good thing, and you know, the city or the town or the beach or whatever it is has just been saved, when it hasn't.
But that's obviously not just an American thing. You know, we're thinking about the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6. Even years afterwards, hearing people say, yeah, but they must have been guilty of something.
Yeah, well, I mean, the guy, what was he called, who was in jail for some time for supposedly having shot Jill Dando. Did he call himself something after Freddie Mercury? Was he called Bolsonaro? So yeah, but Barry George was his. Well, okay, and I remember talking to a police detective here and saying, but it sounds like he didn't do it. This was when he's still in jail. And that detective said to me, yeah, no, he didn't, but I mean, he was an absolute arsehole, so we're happy to be in jail. And I went, you can't say that. Well, I did, and I can.
I've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Woman's got her hand up there. We have someone down the front as well. Yep. And if we have another mic down in the front.
So you alluded to earlier, like this idea of othering in America, and I think increasingly in the UK as well, we've got kind of like a bitterly divided country, and I just wondered how can we, like, and we've got, as you say, like the PR that goes into these cases that promotes the idea, like how can we sort of undo it other than make films?
Well, I think the easiest way is just to go and talk to people who are in the group that you might be being encouraged to be suspicious about. You know, when I was researching Four Lions, I had some of the funniest conversations I had were with, you know, niqabi young Muslim women who were, you know, they were at a trial that I was attending, and they literally, you can just see their eyes, and I found myself in the cafe at lunchtime across the road, and I just thought, I'm going to go over and sit. I'm going to go over and strike up conversation, see what happens. And as soon as the words came out of my, hey, were you at the trial? I thought, what the fuck do I look like? I mean, these are all kind of in their 20s, and I'm just wandering over sort of some weird kind of trial chatter. But actually, I mean, they were a real laugh, and I thought I can have a conversation, I can sort of get through the clothing, but the things they were telling me were hilarious, and they kind of like, they were sort of partly dressed like that to wind people up. They loved nothing more than, you know, somebody like to sit on the tube reading fashion magazines, but dressed up in their niqabs, so that people would be going, they'd sit there and go, why? And I was like, because I like it, you know. It's like those kind of things just break. I think most times if you go up and talk to people, this isn't always true actually. The casting director for All the Lions went and stood outside the Green Lanes Mosque in Birmingham, handing out stuff about, do you want to be part of a sort of a comedy film, and got told to move on by the brothers, you know. But you've got to be careful. But I think that's probably the easiest way. That's what I found, and actually not believing what you're told, because essentially you can find a way. You know, most people, you can find a way of at least agreeing to disagree and working out what is and what isn't different between you. And I think it's quite, we're not, we don't, I mean, we have it easier in London. It's easier to do in London. But it's as much that and not believing the fixed narratives, because the Prevent programme is something that's full of holes and full of mistrust, and has basically put a whole load of sort of patriotic Muslims in a state of thinking that they're being spied on, and there's a lack of trust between them and the Home Office and the law, and that's because, you know, it's been played wrongly. And I think the easiest way to undo things like that is just talk to people, whatever. I mean, this obviously is not going to be listened to by the FBI, and they go, okay, fine, I'll just go. I mean, they won't go and chat to people that they think are suspicious. That's in their water to do that. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, but I think that is probably the simple. Anyone got any other suggestions? I mean, literally, that'll do it, I think.
Benign dictatorship.
Right, so on the one hand, going and talking to people who maybe you feel you're being encouraged to be suspicious of, and on the other hand, benign dictatorship of your own devising or underneath someone else?
The eco-terrorist dictatorship, that'd be okay. Possibly.
Okay.
I'm just
we'll
throwing
talk
things
afterwards.
out here. Look, we're working too well at the minute, you know.
Yeah, it's George Monbiot. I don't know what he's saying.
What I was going to say. First of all, being reminded how great Prince was fantastic.
Oh.
My question was about the character of Kendra, if I've got the name right. I think that's a very interesting character because there's a sort of white liberal conscience there that and I'm going to walk away from the film thinking, how much sympathy should I have given her? How much should I have identified with her? How much empathy should I have had for her? Or was she really the true demon of the film? And I wondered about how you, because I'm trying to think back to Four Lions, whether there was a similar character. No, I don't think there was, but maybe there was. And if you could say where that character came from and maybe what your intention was with that character, if you can.
Well, I wanted there to be a glimmer of active conscience, because not just because it makes it more interesting to have someone within the system questioning it so that it can then override the question, but because in one case, if you're an FBI agent and you accidentally leave your recorder running after you've gone to see the target that you're trying to sort of set up or investigate, then all of that recording has to be made theoretically available to the court. And there was a case where an FBI agent goes back to the office and goes, brilliant, I've just been to see this guy, he's a fucking idiot. He hasn't got a pot to piss in, we're not going to need to offer him more than $50, he'll do anything. And there's a bit of a pause and someone at the table says, is this the sort of person that we should really be investigating? There's another little pause and another voice goes, yep. And that's the Kendra moment. That's how long it lasts. Because if you sustain your skepticism about what's going on, you will end up being frozen out. There's a guy called Mike German who writes very well about the FBI, who was an FBI agent who used to investigate white supremacist groups back in the 90s. And the day he discovered that the evidence was being rigged on a particular trial, he went to his boss and said, this is what's happening. The boss said, good call, Mike. Thank you very much. And then he didn't get any work for the rest of the year and had to leave. So he works now for the Brennan Center for Justice, and he's very well informed and not kind of, he's very clinical in his descriptions about what the FBI does wrong. So with Kendra, I wanted there to be that available, but I didn't really think that the way she drops Moses' look at the end as his child is being thrown into a van is particularly sort of, it doesn't really get her off the hook, does it? So I kind of, in a way, I think it, not to answer your question for you exactly, but it is available to think that she's the worst because she had the opportunity to do something about it. To be fair to her, she did try and do something. She tried to stop him getting shot. There was a case in Detroit, the only case which ended lethally, where the FBI went in heavy, knowing that if anyone was going to get shot, it wasn't going to be them, it was going to be their target. And they did it for sort of political reasons. So, she at least could see that might be problematic. But also you could argue she knew that that was her case, and then if it ended in a bloodbath, that was going to be on her watch, which is why I wanted her to accept the promotion that's shown in the cards at the end. So it's like, and that's really to represent the small voice of sort of skepticism or challenge that is permitted in the FBI. It's very, very rare to find anyone who takes anything all the way through, because it's like a big gang and you don't rock the boat. And Anna was extremely clear that she did not want to be seen to be let off the hook. I I mean, she performed that look like a bastard.
Well, I mean, in my view, bad things happen not because bad people do things, but because good people keep quiet. So, I mean, it's interesting.
Or go along with them, or forget about it. Yes, I mean, it's a sidestep is a better, I guess, path to evil than it's a more common one, isn't it? I think that's the thing to note. I mean, it's very hard to turn around the trend. It's you know, in America there's there's a very efficient response to if you put someone in the dock and say they're on trial for being a terrorist, it's very, very difficult to get a good defence. Not a good defence in terms of competence, but a defence that will get them off.
On that light note, unfortunately, I'm getting a signal that we have to bring this to a close.
Yeah, we have to finish at 8:47.
Thank you very much to Ewan and Curzon for organising this, but most of all, can you please join me in thanking Chris Morris?